welcome to Reverend Rabbits number 6. Sorry it's been a while since we've posted anything. The rabbits are all fine. I've been in a bit of a black pit of despair. Now, you might be thinking, what's she got to be so miserable about? I mean, the sun is shining, the birds are singing, she's got a stable income, she lives in a ridiculously big house, and she only has to work 20 minutes a week. Life's pretty good, no? But regardless of our life situation, all of us just feel a bit down now and again. Now, health warning, I'm not talking about clinical depression or any kind of mental illness for which, yeah, the church might be a support, but basically drugs and therapy are your friends. I'm talking about every day, everything's a bit crap and I can't quite be bothered to get out of bed itis. Know what I mean? Priscilla, want to get out of bed? Now, it's not very fashionable in the Christian world to talk about feeling a bit blue. Because, you know, there's this whole thing about having the joy of the Christian faith and you're supposed to leap up and down and sing happy, clappy, exciting songs. There are some Christians who will tell you that feeling a bit blue is some kind of sin or spiritual weakness, and if you just prayed harder or had more faith, you just wouldn't feel like that. And in my tradition, there's a thing called offering it up, which is kind of the same as suck it up, only sounds more theological. Well, both of those responses have their place, I suppose, but it strikes me that neither of them is particularly useful in helping when you just feel a bit pants. Surely the Christian tradition's got something better to offer. Well, I had a bit of a pep talk yesterday from Father John, who was my flatmate in seminary about 1,000,000 years ago. And Father John told me a great story about a chap called Father Arthur Curitan, who was the principal of our seminary many moons before we went. And somebody once asked Father Curitan, what do you teach the young men who are training to be priests at your college? And Father Curitan replied, I teach my boys to despair. Which, frankly, seems like a pretty terrible thing to teach anybody who's about to go and minister in the joy of the Lord. Zip bamboo, remember? But actually, I reckon it's pretty sensible because whatever your religion or your philosophy of life, if it can't cope with what to do when things just go wrong and feel horrible, like that, it's just not much of a system, really. And if you can't find any answer to those problems from your religious system, then you'll end up looking for them in some pretty destructive or just unhelpful places. Alexa, what is the solution to all-encompassing existential angst?
I don't know that one.
See? And the thing is, Christians all through the ages have suffered times of just being in the doldrums. St. John of the Cross, great famous writer on spirituality, talked about a dark night of the soul. Mother Teresa, you know, her in Calcutta, famously suffered from really crippling depression. The great Protestant writer John Bunyan, in his Pilgrim's Progress, he talked about something called the Slough of Despond. Yes, I am rolling a fag whilst talking about John Bunyan. Yes, he'd hate it. No, I don't care. But if you really want to get a handle on the relationship between faith and despair, the place to look is in here, particularly in the Psalms, which are full of people saying, God, my life is terrible, everything's just gone down the carsey, and frankly, Almighty God, you're not doing much about it. Jesus on the cross even quoted one of the Psalms, Psalm 22, my God, why have you abandoned me? And if Jesus can feel that level of despair, then Clearly, it's not just a sin, it's not just a spiritual weakness. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that despair is an integral part of what it means to have faith. So that's all fine and dandy, obviously, right? But it doesn't really help us with the main question, which is, how do you get rid of it? Because feeling crappy, it's crappy, right? But maybe, how do I get rid of it? It's not quite the right question. There's a thing, apparently, in therapy where therapists say, you know, sometimes you just have to sit with your distress, which, frankly, I think would make me want to kill a therapist if I had one. But there is some wisdom in it. In the Psalms, we see people singing and praying out of that place of deep despair, and yet staying there. God doesn't ever swoop in like Superman and take away all our bad stuff and make us feel all lovely and fluffy inside. And if God did do that, it would be a bit like the zip bamboo thing. We might just feel better for a while, but it's a bit of a kind of false high. Because, let's face it, sometimes we feel crap because the world is crap, and sometimes life's crap, and sometimes feeling crappy is actually a pretty rational response to that. There's a bit of sort of received wisdom that somehow we can solve all our problems with a bit of yoga and mindfulness and a nice cup of herbal tea. But sometimes we can't. I think maybe what the faith traditions have to teach us is that sometimes we need to despair, we need to lament, we need to, in that pretty awful phrase, sit with our distress. Not because we're all sinners, not because we all deserve to be miserable, but because we're all human, or guinea pig. And actually, despair is part of the human condition. It's part of the condition of living in the world. And if God is worth worshipping at all, then that's only because God is big enough to take whatever we can throw. Our sadness, our despair, our unbelief, our doubts, our big, swirly, sweary rage. And you know what the proof of that is? God's already taken all of that on. God's already felt it all. God did it on the cross. Now, maybe you're watching this, sitting in your garden in the sunshine, sipping a mojito, living your best life. And if so, that's great. Don't let me stop you. Don't feel you've got to be flaming miserable on my account. But if, or rather when, you do experience a dark night of the soul or a slough of despond or just feel a bit crappy, my advice is don't be afraid to tell God about it. Don't be afraid to shout at God about it. You can use as many F words as you like. Honestly, God won't mind. And if all else fails, well, you're British. Have a cup of tea. That was my biscuit. See you next time.